What was it then, the bond between him and the Queen, do you think?
I think at the core of it, it was faith. You know, the very fact that she saw him on television that first time and heard him preach and then invited him to come to meet herself and to also meet Prince Philip and the rest of their family, it was the bond was Jesus. The bond was the gospel, because that was central to her life from the time she was a little girl. You'd often hear her speak about the Jesus that she knew and understood, and the gospel that brought such hope to her life. And like all of us, the Queen wasn't absent from having tragedy and struggles and difficulties. We know all of that, pretty well documented, though she was tight-lipped on things. But we know the gospel has an answer for all those things, and I think that Mr. Graham, in meeting not just her, but any world leader, or you and me, if he were sitting here today with us, he'd still get to the concept of the gospel. That was what he lived for.
Seeing him on TV in 1955, what do you believe are the impressions that, you know, she saw, those qualities?
Well, first of all, those were the great days of black and white, so I'm sure it was kind of stark to see. I think it was his dynamic preaching. I think it was his singular focus. If you listen to Mr. Graham, he would always preach nearly the same message. Even though he would contemporize it and he would have illustrations, it always came back to the cross of Jesus, to the blood of Jesus that we know is central to our faith, and the resurrection. And so he would preach with authority. He preached urgently. He preached with energy. And so even from a small black and white television set in 1955, one could sense that about him. And I think that's what drew the Prince and the Queen to see him in that regard, and to be intrigued by this man from America who could preach such truth, but preach it simply. He wasn't a grandiose preacher with big words. He brought it simply to the matter of the gospel. And because she shared that heartbeat with him in the very beginning, I think that's what spanned the decades of their relationship together.
His influence on the British people, then, how would you describe it?
Remarkable. There was an evangelist in American history like Mr. Graham. His name was Dwight L. Moody. This is from the 1800s. Mr. Moody was a great preacher as well. His extensive ministry was in the United States, but also Great Britain. So several decades later, when Mr. Graham would stand to preach, it was already built on that kind of gospel presentation that had been made from the American shores to the British people. And so there was something about having a foreign accent, an American accent, I think that probably galvanized early times in Britain for people to hear him. He was such a powerful proclaimer. But I think it was those moments, and again, I said he preached 21 separate meetings there over the course of several decades. So he is plowing himself into the life of the Church of England and to the church in general in Britain. Many people came to hear him. Many people responded to the message, and I think in many ways it changed the course of the church history there. I think historians that look back on that time now say that was a very special time in Britain for the time Mr. Graham preached. Because there's a sense of mourning and grief, of course. Here was a leader, marvelous individual of 70 years on the throne. And so for many of them, it's the only person they've known like that, the only monarch they've known. And so there is naturally, at the time of anyone's death, especially an important death like this one, that it causes people to look inward to their own life and their own mortality. So an extension of the Billy Graham ministry through Franklin today is that we have chaplains on the ground praying, encouraging, and speaking the gospel in Great Britain at this moment to those that are hurting. I think that's a marvelous testimony to Mr. Graham's long-tenured ministry and relationship with the Queen. He first preached there in 1954, and would end up preaching 21 more times in a series of meetings. He preached more in Great Britain than anywhere else in the world except for the United States. So you can understand why he had a heart for these people and love for this incredible country. It was in 1955, he was preaching in Scotland. He had already been to the great Haringey meeting in 1954. This is the next year. And in that particular year, it was Good Friday of 1955, for the first time the BBC carried a religious programming live. It had not been done before, and they carried his preaching from Scotland. Now the reason to tell you that date is because the Prince Philip and the Queen saw Mr. Graham on that television program, and that set a chain of events to her inviting him to come to Buckingham Palace for a meeting. And so over the course of the next 3 weeks, this is in 1955, they would meet on more than one occasion. He met with the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret and the Queen for the very first time at Clarendon House. And then the next meeting was for lunch at Buckingham Palace with Prince Philip and the Queen, and then one additional meeting before he left. Well, we tell you all that because that set in motion their years of relationship and friendship. So we know that at least there are 12 documented times when he met with the Queen in a variety of places, not only in Great Britain, but also here in the United States. He would often attend White House state dinners when she was being accorded that privilege under Mr. Reagan, under Mr. Bush, and I believe under the Nixon presidency. There were a number of times she was in this country, and so they would meet every time she was here. But they shared a common bond, which is interesting. And that bond was really based on that first program she heard him preach in 1955. That bond is faith, the gospel of Jesus Christ. She, as Mr. Graham would tell us, deeply spiritual person in her own right. You know, in her grand title as Queen, there's a phrase that says defender of the faith. That's what she was. So she's really the head of the Church of England. Just a remarkable life, but they shared that common bond. And here's a picture of him, of course, speaking at the Queen's Chapel.
Yes.
And this would have been right here. It's the second one here.
And that's the Queen's Chapel?
Yes, that's right. At Windsor, and I believe that was 1984.
Oh.
And so you'll see the Queen Mother, you'll see Prince Philip in the portrait, the Queen as well, and there you see Mr. and Mrs. Graham. So he was afforded that privilege. Now that would have been at her invitation.